Still quite light outside, but we've got 10 minutes. Let's calm down. The potato changed my life. The potato showed me the way. I think it might be recording. Should I stop it? Big potato saved my life. Saved my life. Potato showed me the way. Showed me the way. Can't remember the words. Like a big potato. Stay inside. All this. Right, here we go. You're now recording.
You're in charge of madness, I've heard, Ruth.
It's all going to be very, very civilized, I'm sure. Well,
okay. Perfectly.
Okay, so, right. Why are we doing champagne? Well, we're doing champagne because I love champagne, because it pairs really, really nice with fish and chips, and I also love fish and chips. It's also Friday. I'm sure there's something that says that we have to have fish and chips on a Friday. Well, what was that? Too many people. Have to
Wasn't lost.
announce yourself first and then speak, and that way we'll be able to hear what you say. I think, hopefully. There is also if you go to the bottom of the screen, there's like a speech bubble, at least there is on mine. There's a speech bubble, and underneath it says chat.
Yes.
And if you click on that, then you should be able to, like a thing will come up on the side. And if you're trying to speak and you're not being heard, if you just type any questions or anything in there, if I just double check it, I've just written hi. So hopefully you'll be able to see that come up. And then I will be able to see that if anybody writes anything. And it might keep things a little bit less kind of hectic, maybe. But yeah, this is the first time we've done this, so it's going to be a little bit like, we'll see how it goes a little bit, maybe. Oh, everybody's saying hi, that's nice. Cheers, everybody. Lovely.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Andrew's here as well, but he's cooking fish and chips in the background.
Cheers, Andrew.
So why do fish and chips and champagne go so well together? The reason for that is mostly because champagne is really, really high in acidity. So in the same way that you might use lemon on your fish, or you might put vinegar on your chips or something, it cuts through the fat and it just tastes really nice. On top of that, the flavour profiles go really well together. Neither of them overpower each other too much. There's quite a lot of flavour in champagne, but not too much. So whereas if you were going to have like a big old Malbec or something, then it would just be too much and too overpowering for the fish. And also red wine doesn't go very nice with fatty stuff either. So that's why we're pairing these two together. That, and there's just loads to talk about when it comes to champagne, because of the way it's made. It's got a lovely history, and there's plenty of opportunity for anybody to ask any questions that you might have. The first thing I think I ever learned about wine was that you weren't allowed to call it champagne unless it comes from France and it's sparkling wine from the Champagne region, and that is true. And so I think it's one of the regions that people hear the most like rumors about. And if anybody has any questions where they're like, is this true, is that true, my dad told me this, I don't know if I believe him, I get all those questions all the time, so feel free to ask those. No such thing as a stupid question. I have got a diploma in wine, so, and I teach up to the sort of vocational equivalent to A-level, so yeah, I should hopefully be able to answer any questions, fingers crossed. Cool. But first of all, what we're going to do is taste it together, and then you can just crack up with drinking whilst I rabbit on at you about wine.
Okay.
Lovely.
Hi, Mary. Sorry.
Everybody wave at everyone.
I can't see you.
That's a civilized way to be a quarantine. This is great.
Can't see Pete and Mary. I can see Mary. I can see Mary, can't see Pete.
No. Oh, taste it. Right.
I'm sort of in the fog.
Yeah, I don't understand.
Oh, you're in the
how
fog.
so foggy.
Mm.
Who's in
I think it must be our
Pete,
camera, I
W
think.
Maybe.
in the fog.
Very foggy camera. Okay, so
Okay.
what I want you to think about when we taste the wine, the first thing I want you to do, I should have got you to prepare this really, but if you can find a white piece of paper or just something that's white nearby, so there's any piece of paper, and then if you hold your glass of wine in front of it, you'll probably see that it's got a little bit of colour to it. That's if you've got like champagne. If you haven't got champagne, don't worry. But if you've got champagne, it will have a little bit of colour to it. And that's because champagne is a little bit mature. The way that it's made and the grapes it's made from means it will always have a bit of colour. Whereas if you've had like a glass of Prosecco or that lovely French stuff that you get from the supermarket that costs €1 a bottle that I know some of you.
I don't even call it lovely, Ruth.
Moved on, darling, moved on.
I might have partaken of some of that myself. That will be really, really pale because it's made really differently. Champagne is made so that it will always have this colour. So first thing we do, look at it, and that's giving you a sign already that it's champagne.
Yeah.
Then
It isn't.
Yeah, this isn't.
No.
what's that, Tim?
This isn't. It's Cremant.
Oh, Cremel's close enough. It's good enough.
Oh, good.
This
Yeah,
isn't.
sort of
this is
halfway
Saumur.
there. We'll have some colour, but not.
Gary, did you get the widow?
Ooh, where's Gary gone?
I don't know where he's gone.
I have this.
Ooh, what's that, Charles?
Ooh.
Ooh,
don't know.
I bet
Do you
that's
know this?
that's made in a very different way. So
Oh.
that will probably be quite pale in colour, but that's fine. It doesn't matter. We're just going to learn mostly about champagne, but that's Prosecco. That would be just delicious.
Okay.
So you'll be looking at yours thinking that's not got much colour, Ruth. That's what are you talking about? But that's
It looks a bit yellow. Let me
oh,
show
good.
you.
The next bit I want you to do is I want you to smell it.
Oh.
And if you've been smelling it, if you've been drinking it, and if you've been eating other things, one of the ways you could sort of reset your body to zero is to just smell your arm, the back of your arm, and that's your reset smell, if you like, and then go back
I
to
haven't showered yet.
don't smell Tim's arm.
Everybody watch our arms.
Nobody go near Tim. And it smells, hopefully you can smell it a little bit. It will smell like a kind of yeasty, bready kind of pastry.
Yes, it does.
Oh, you often smell of yeasty bread.
Shush.
We call that smell autolytic character. If you want to know the proper
What do you call it?
term, autolytic character. What I'll do, I'll type that for you in the little thing.
Oh, wow. Autolytic.
Autolytic.
There you go, autolytic. And it's to
Okay.
do with the fact that the way that it's made, and we'll come back to that later. But that's if we talk about yeast autolysis, that's what it's going to be talking about. The process that gives it that smell. And if it doesn't have that smell, then it's not really champagne. It won't have gone through the champagne process.
Right.
So if you've got a Prosecco, then you will probably not have that. You probably won't get the yeasty smell, because the way they make Prosecco is all about keeping it fresh and light and fruity. Whereas where they make champagne is all about giving it that kind of extra smell. Cool.
How long on average does it take to get from autolytic to paralytic?
45 minutes, I think. We can try it. We'll time you. We've got video. We'll have like video evidence tonight, so we'll see.
It's a lovely word, isn't it? Autolytic. It's the way it's written, pronounced. Beautiful word.
Yeah, and it sort of means, it's kind of gross in what it means. It kind of refers to the fact that it's eating itself.
Oh, yum.
Yeast is kind of self-consuming, but it sounds great and it tastes delicious, so that's good.
What
And
does
they
that mean that it's eating itself?
What was that, sorry?
What does it mean that it's eating itself?
So when I'll explain the context in a bit, but at the time when we're undergoing this kind of aging process where we get this autolytic character, what's happening is the yeast is in the bottle and it's run out of sugar. So it's got no sugar left to eat, but so the next closest thing to sugar for it to consume, if you like, is itself. So it undergoes what is essentially like a chemical reaction with the wine and the yeast, which creates that. But that's where the auto comes from. It's sort of a self-fulfilling thing. It does it itself. That's probably not the proper way to describe it. You'll discover tonight I am not a biologist, so my science is a little bit dodgy. But you have to just go along with me a little bit. Cool. Was there a question? Ooh.
Smelling around, probably.
Oh yeah.
Oh.
Oh no!
Who said
Right.
that?
I want to know the silliest thing I get people to do. Well, one of them is how to tell if something is sweet or not. So if you smell something, sometimes it can smell sweet, but it's not actually sweet. So something can smell like vanilla, but it still be really dry, or it can smell like lemons, but actually be really sweet. So the best way to isolate the sugar is to hold your nose and then just dip the tip of your tongue in the wine.
I can't do that. That's like it's like rubbing your belly and patting your head. It's really difficult to do.
You've got to breathe, actually.
Oh yeah,
You
definitely
recording
breathe.
this?
Breathing.
Oh, I forgot to breathe.
Oh, it's Tom.
It tastes much sweeter when I take my hand away from my nose.
Yes, yeah. That's because the extra
Tastes better,
sweetness
it's
is
getting
coming through.
English.
This is very sweet.
Very good.
Yeah, prosecco is quite sweet. That will be sweet. Yeah, always. Whereas champagne often
This one's not
is
sweet.
dry. What I want you to do now is just take a sip of it, and I want you to take a sip and just sort of swirl it around in your mouth, and if possible, kind of breathe some air through the wine as well when you have it in your mouth. I'll sort of show you what I mean. Oh, I can hear some good gurgling noises. That's good.
Yeah, we can do that.
But I don't know. Yeah, you see, it's so slow.
Oh, I think there's some IT issues.
That's really interesting.
Mm.
Yeah, Tom didn't do a lot of swirling there. He just swallowed.
Remind us why we're doing that bit.
Why are we telling tales?
We'll put a bit hectic again. Okay, so if you have any questions about that, if you type it in the little chat thing, but hopefully, if you've got champagne in your glass, hopefully you'll find that you get quite a lot of flavour from the wine, and when you breathe air through it, you actually get more flavour than if you just swallow it. And that's because you've got all these sort of olfactory sensors down the back of your nose, back of your throat, that you normally wouldn't really hit. But when you breathe air through them, you're going to maximise how much you can taste it, so you get extra flavour. But if you've got something quite light and delicate like Prosecco, you're going to get less from that, but you will still get more flavour than if you just swallow it like normally.
A lot of flavour, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. Our Cremant tasted more like champagne with that.
Oh yes, yes. So Cremant has the same autolytic process, but normally for less time. So, and I know you're a big fan of Veuve Clicquot, aren't you? That has quite a lot of the autolytic character. So
That's probably what Gary's thinking at the moment.
Oh, lucky Gary. Wonderful. And what I want you to have noticed in particular about the champagne is the fact that it's really high in acidity. And you can tell that not just because it might make your eyes go ooh a little bit at the corner, but because after you've finished, once you've swallowed the wine, it will make the inside of your mouth water. It will make your mouth salivate, and that's because your mouth is an alkaline environment, and it wants to remain that way to protect your teeth and your enamel and stuff. So if you put something in it that's high in acidity, and this is like really high acidity wine, then your mouth is going to try and sort of bring that back into balance as fast as possible. So champagne will make your mouth water loads, and that is the
Oh, okay.
forward. That
Certainly does
thing
make
that
the
goes
chips
really well with.
a lot better. I tell you what.
Oh, what was that? Sorry.
They certainly make chips taste wonderful.
Excellent.
Mm.
So, oh yeah, we've got
You
some
would
chips
be.
in.
Yeah.
I finished mine.
Yeah, you can have some of mine if you want to.
So the fat in the chips, and the fat on the potentially on the fish as well, might leave a little bit of sort of fat inside in your mouth if you then take a sip of the champagne. It basically just cleanses your mouth, and it will, you know, it will also soften down the fat in the food, will soften down the acidity in the wine, so it doesn't taste as acidic. It will seem softer and rounder, maybe. But if you don't get that, don't worry. Everybody has a different experience whenever they do a wine tasting. But generally speaking, that's
I love
what they have.
combination.
I may just have to have another glass to check.
Yeah, you definitely need to have another glass to check.
Perhaps you need another bottle.
Well, that's true. That's true.
I must admit the champagne doesn't help the taste of this fish finger. No.
We've got the first ever question come in, which is the salivating why people who drink champers get horse breath?
Horse breath.
Get what?
I don't even know what that is. Delia, was that you?
I don't know.
Delia.
Maybe it's a nurse thing.
Maybe it's a nurse thing.
And what do they get? I missed it.
Apparently they get horse breath.
Oh, like
Horse
poo
breath.
people
Oh.
talk
Really?
about.
Oh, what, Delia?
No, it's just me.
I don't think anyone else has ever experienced it, but
That's maybe because we
I
don't all.
don't think so.
yeah, maybe we don't drink enough champagne. That's what the problem is.
Okay.
We don't know enough horses.
Or we don't know enough horses. That's true.
Is that just because you get really drunk and forget to clean your teeth before you go to bed?
Ah.
That could explain it. I love it. Yeah, that's a new one for me. So I've learned something tonight. So
Me too.
We all are.
I don't know it's a fact yet.
right, okay. So what I might do now is just talk to you a little bit about the history of champagne. Should I just mute everybody so you can all hear me more easily? Is that a good idea? Or is that being really
You
rude?
mean shut up, don't you?
I'll just mute you all,
Please.
and then, ooh. Right, so I've muted you all, but you can all, I've left you with your powers to unmute yourself. So it just make it a little bit easier if one person then has a question that they want to chip in with, that if you unmute yourself, it's, you know, I think we'll probably get people a little bit one by one, as opposed to like 5 people chipping in at the same time, hopefully. But like I say, this is a bit of an experiment. So any feedback that you have after this, I will greatly appreciate. And apologies if there are bits that aren't the smoothest of wine tastings you might have been to. Okay, so champagne. There is a very long and rich history of champagne. It wasn't always a sparkling wine region, and there's an awful lot of stories told about champagne that are partly true, but they're not all completely true. There used to be a still wine area, and there were sparkling wines that existed before champagne was a thing. So down in the south of France, there's a process that they call méthode ancestrale, which some of you that live in France might have come across written on bottles a bit. And this would have been how the first champagne was made as well. And what it would have happened is that fermentation is a process which where the yeast will eat the sugar in the grape juice, and that will process that sugar and turn it into alcohol, carbon dioxide, flavors, heat, loads of other things. what would normally happen in a normal warmish climate where you're fermenting your wine would be that your yeast, your natural yeast in the environment, would start fermenting the sugars in the grape juice, and that would turn it into wine, and then you would bottle that when that process naturally comes to an end, and you've got a lovely, fairly dry wine, and all the sugar's been turned to alcohol, and it's flat because you've allowed all that carbon dioxide to just escape out of the wine, which is great. That's how normal wine is made. Not modern wine necessarily, but that's how normal traditional wine would be made. However, Champagne and some other regions are very, very cool. And what they might find is that the fermentation would stop unnaturally early, before the yeast has eaten all the sugar. And the reason it would do that is because it would get particularly cold. And if it gets cold early on in the autumn before the fermentation's finished, then it's not going to be able to ferment all the sugar. But the coldness doesn't kill the yeast. So as soon as the wine warms up again, it's going to start fermenting again. Does that make sense? As long as the yeast there's the sugar there. Nice, lovely nodding. I like the nodding. Cool. So what they would be doing is bottling this wine and putting it into containers after the fermentation has stopped, thinking that's it, but it wasn't it. And then the next spring, when it gets warmer again, in these sealed bottles, they would be becoming slowly and slowly fizzier, without necessarily the winemaker knowing it. So there would have been at this point quite a few exploding bottles. And then eventually throughout sort of 17th, 18th century, people started developing stronger and stronger glass bottles that they could then withstand all this extra pressure that was being put on the glass by these newly sparkling wines. So that's one of the reasons why it would happen in Champagne. Champagne is nice and cool. So yeah, it was actually English glass. English glass was the big breakthrough when it came to producing, being able to be strong enough to withhold loads of extra atmospheres worth of pressure. So I think most champagne comes out about 3 or 4 atmospheres worth of pressure in a bottle, which is quite a lot. That's why the champagne bottles are really like sturdy. If you lift one up, they're really like powerfully strong at the bottom to stop them exploding. And there's a guy called Christopher Merritt. And if you talk to a lot of British people, they will love to tell you that in the wine world, they'd love to tell you that Christopher Merritt invented champagne, which is obviously rubbish. It's just the British people claiming everything again. It's not completely a lie, but it's not a full truth either. So this guy was a scientist, and he created this process. He perfected this process of the second fermentation. So he wasn't relying on this natural process of the wine stopping the fermentation. He wanted to create something that was predictable and that he could control how much alcohol was going to be added and how much sparkling was going to go into the bottle. So he was doing this all in a lab, and he created this process of the second fermentation where you're adding extra sugar. You're adding extra sugar to the bottle, and then you're sealing it off, and then you're purposefully creating this second fermentation. And that is what the French term prise de mousse, so the putting of the sparkle into the bottle, but it's not really inventing champagne. That's creating a controlled sparkling wine, if you like. Then we have our famous Dom Perignon comes along, and he perfects the art of this autolysis. So the process of champagne so far, we have taken our grapes, we have fermented our grapes into a still wine, and we've put that wine into this bottle. Great, so we've got still wine in the bottle. What we're going to do then is the Christopher Merritt technique. We're going to add some sugar to this, we're going to add some yeast, and then we're going to put like a beer cap on the bottle like that. And that's going to stop any of this second fermentation carbon dioxide escaping. And so what you're going to have is a sparkling wine by the time that's happened. That's going to take 2-3 weeks by the time that's happened. So we've got a sparkling wine, but it's still not champagne. So you've got sparkling wine. We're going to leave it lying underground in a nice cave for maybe a year, maybe a year and a half, maybe 3 years, maybe even a decade if you want to make a super swanky bottle of champagne. And during that time is when that autolysis is taking place. So the yeast is going to be eating itself and reacting with the wine and creating that delicious extra kind of yeasty, fruity character that you get that smells a bit like brioche or toast. If you lie it down like this for like a decade, it will smell quite a lot like Marmite by that time. It really does get quite pokey. So it depends if you like Marmite, whether or not you'd like that or not. And then that is champagne. Today, what they do, they undergo quite an extensive process of getting the yeast then, the dead yeast, into the neck of the bottle like that. They'll then freeze just the neck of the bottle. So it's a solid lump of yeast. They'll let out they'll take off the beer cap off the top, and that then the atmosphere inside will just pop out all the solid yeast out. And so you've then got sparkling wine, you've got rid of your dead yeast, you top it up with a bit of sugar, a bit of wine, and then you put your cork in it, you put the cage around it, and then you cover it in foil so no one can see how full it is. And that's champagne. So that is how it is made. I might just unmute you now. Does anybody have any questions about any of that?
I was going to ask why you don't have sludge in the bottom, but I guess you've just answered it.
Yes, it's because they go through this process. They call it riddling, where they get it to the top, into the neck here, and then it's disgorgement is this process where they pop it out, if you like, and that's
what did they do before they froze it?
What was that? Sorry.
What did they do before they froze the neck of the bottle? Because they must have made champagne before they had that process.
So they did, and quite frequently they would just have they wouldn't use clear glass bottles. It was the process. This had to be perfected really when clear glass was engineered, and previous to this, glass would have really not been particularly see-through, and it was less of an issue. It would have been a little bit grainy, and it would have had little like texture to it and slightly less pleasant, and it was over time this perfection of this technique. So they would use like below freezing brine solution and like get like their ice from the ice caves and stuff in order to do it. But yeah, it's a relatively recent process they've managed to perfect here.
Don't open that bottle for ages.
How did they get the yeast out of the bottle without the rest of the champagne coming out?
Yeah.
So they just freeze it like that in the neck. There'll be a solid lump here, and then they turn it the right way round again. So then you will have this like really fizzy wine here, a little like air gap with loads of pressure in this area. You see the loads of pressure from here. Solid wine lump frozen here with all the yeast in it. They just take off the beer cap, or more ancient techniques if they had other, if it was older days than that, and they would just release that. It would just pop out, and then they would top it up with some extra wine and some sugar so you've got a little bit of sweetness in it, because nobody wants it really, really dry because it tastes really acidic and a bit gross. So you top it up with a bit, and then you quickly put the cork in. But one of the things was they never knew how much wine they would lose, so that's why they would use the foil. Kind of
is like some of the gas released at that moment, and then it makes some more?
Yes, so some of it is, and there are some producers might add a little bit of carbon dioxide at this point, and they might be using a couple of different older wines as well to create a slightly different flavour too. It depends on the producer. But it would have slightly less than atmospheric pressure in it afterwards, after this process. Any other questions?
Yeah, just about. So you said it can take like 10 years to get like a really good bottle. Yeah. But if you were to go to a supermarket and buy I don't know, medium to bottom range, like how long has it taken for like an average bottle of champagne?
So an entry-level bottle of champagne, to call it champagne legally, it has to be at least a year lying down like that. And then it must be another 3 months that it's matured after that in the cave. And so that is a minimum. So for example, this is Bollinger. Unfortunately, this isn't what I'm drinking tonight, but they are, you know, they're like a super swanky, lovely producer of champagne. And they will be maturing their wines for 3-4 years just to create this house style. But if you were drinking like the one that we're on, which is like a supermarket brand, then that would be probably much closer to the minimum, depending on which supermarket you're going to, of course. But
and again, you said a year and 3 months. So a year and then 3 months in a cave.
Yes. And if it is a vintage wine, and you can tell it's a vintage wine because it will tell you the year on it. It'll just tell you the year that the grapes were picked. If it's a vintage wine, that means all of those grapes have come from that year, and it has to be in the cave for at least 3 years. So that's going to be like a richer style and more expensive.
I'm presuming that this is sort of just a bog standard kind of champagne.
Nonsense, good. Yeah. That's above bog standard. That's one of your kind of more affordable mid-range, I think.
Oh, okay. It was all they had in the co-op.
Well, it's a nice champagne, definitely.
It's proper tasty, isn't it? Lanson is really good. It's really tasty.
It's one of the oldest champagne houses that there are, and it's a good quality champagne, definitely.
Oh, that's okay.
There's no date on this birth. There's no date of the grapes on this one.
No, so that will be non-vintage. Most champagne is non-vintage, and by that we mean it's a blend of different years. And they do that in order to create like a house style, so you should know what to expect year in, year out. And they also do it because champagne is so northern, like within the bracket of where you can grow grapes to make high quality wine, it's really far away from the equator. And when you have, we call that a marginal climate, and some years you just have to have like a couple of degrees on average temperature lower than what you might expect, and you're not going to be able to ripen your grapes properly. So then in those years they'd need to blend in more from these other older years of the wine that to make the quality higher. So that's why the vintage wines, if it's all from 1 year and it tells you that year on the bottle, then that should be a really good year. So that's another reason why it'd be more expensive.
Right.
How long sparkling wine then? Sorry, I should never have brought. How long would sparkling wine take?
So Prosecco, that is made in a slightly different way. So instead of making that sparkling in the bottle, they make that sparkling in a big tank. So they'll make the wine like nice, and they'll keep the wine nice and fresh, because the whole point of Prosecco is not to have that extra flavour, it's just to be like light and fruity and love, you know. And so they'll put it all in a big tank. They'll put some sugar into that tank and the yeast, and then they'll make a sparkling wine. They'll immediately then filter out the yeast at the point where they've decided it's sparkling enough, and they'll bottle it, and then that's what you get. So it's a totally different process. It's to create a totally different style.
Okay, thank you.
There are some styles that you can get. So you don't get it so much from Europe, because they've got quite a lot of strict laws about how you make sparkling wines in Europe. But outside of Europe, say if you're getting a wine from New Zealand, Australia or something, often they'll be produced they'll be made sparkling in the bottle to give it the extra flavour. But then they won't undergo that whole process of getting the yeast out that was a big pain in the bum. They'll just release it all into a big tank, filter out the yeast, and then bottle it again in a different bottle. And then that just makes it a bit cheaper and easier. But it's not considered as high quality a process, but you can get sometimes that is a bit of the best of both worlds, because it's a bit cheaper, but you still get extra flavour. All good?
All good.
Any other questions about that?
What does imperial mean on a bottle?
Imperial? Which one have you got there? Is that Moet?
Yeah, Moët and Chandon.
I think that's just how they describe it, I think that's just part of their branding. As far as I'm aware, there's no actual meaning behind imperial.
There's
Yeah,
no
I've only
year
seen
on
it on their bottles.
No, there's no year.
No, that would be their normal non-vintage. Most of what is made in France, most of the champagne that's produced is non-vintage. That's their standard, and then it's
Very nice though.
yeah.
Thank you, Ross.
They're the people. Their top end champagne is the Dom Perignon. They're the ones who claim the rich history.
Moet made Dom Perignon as well, do
That's their their cuvée prestige, they call it. So, for example, Bollinger, they have Grand Année, which is theirs, which is what James Bond's always drinking, definitely being paid to be drinking. They have Roederer, has Cristal. Who else? So Paul Roger has the Winston Churchill. They all have these top champagnes that they made, and
what's the Veuve Clicquot, the Grey Lake? What's the old? What's the top brand of the Veuve Clicquot again?
That's called the Grand Dame.
The Grand Dame, that's the one.
Grand Dame, yeah. And you can tell which ones they are because they cost about 4 times as much. They're expensive. Cool. So there are 3 different grapes, 3 main grapes that go into champagne. Do you know what they are?
Chardonnay.
Chardonnay is one. Yeah.
Chablis.
Semillon.
Not Semillon.
Oh.
Chablis.
Pardon?
Pinot Noir.
Pinot Noir is one.
Chenin.
Blanc.
Not Chenin.
Oh.
It's there's Cremant de Loire that I think you might be thinking of there, Tim and Terry, because a lot of those grapes go into that. The 3 major ones for champagne are Pinot Noir is the most, then Pinot Meunier, less well known, but is a big part of champagne, and then Chardonnay. And Pinot Noir and Pinot Meunier, they're both black grapes. And that's one of the other reasons why champagne will always have a little bit of colour, because they press the grapes really gently, but they'll always get a little bit of colour. And all the colour is in the skins. So if you really gently press it, then you're going to get very light amounts of colour coming out.
Yeah.
If you were to just take the black grapes and press them normally with a bit of force like you would for a normal wine, then you'd actually be making a pink wine. So they have to be really, really careful when they make champagne. Make it pink.
Right. Oh, wow. That's interesting.
And again, one of the reasons that they do that is because some years, some of the grapes would not have ripened properly. So they really struggle. So they'd have to blend to make it. So they could still create a nice wine in years when, say, the Pinot Noir didn't ripen or something. So it's similar the reason why they blend in Bordeaux or other country places as well, just to sort of ensure that you get a stylistic continuation, even if the year's a bit different if you have a rubbish year. Cool. What else did I want to tell you about? Yes. So, dosage. Have you heard of dosage? Did we talk about that?
What did that say?
Dosage.
Dosage. Have you ever heard of dosage?
Well, I know the word.
Yes. Yeah, I've heard it a lot before I knew what it was. It's dosage, DOSAGE, and it's talking about how much sugar, how much sweetness we're going to add to the wine at the point that we're just before we're going to sell it. So we're not putting this in at the start, because if we did, then the yeast would just eat it whilst it's going through this process before it starts autolysis. So we have to add it at the end after we've got rid of the yeast. And we top up the wine at the very end. We've just got the yeast out. We top it up with some wine, but we're also going to add a certain amount of sugar to that. And how much sugar you're going to add is going to affect the sweetness level in the wine when you buy it and drink it. And there's quite a few. The most important ones for the market for champagne are Brut, which is what we drink a lot of in this country. And they certainly drink a lot of that in France as well. And also Demi-Sec, which is really especially popular in France. But I'm going to just run you through the full list from driest to sweetest, because that's an important point especially when it comes to Prosecco drinking as well. It starts with Brut Nature, which is like no extra. They call that like what do you call it? If you go, diet champagne. It's really not very nice. So you're doing that. Brut Nature, so no extra sweeteners at all. Then extra brut, and then brut, which is what most people will think of when they think of champagne. Then we have extra dry, which is what a lot of Prosecco gets called. Then we have dry, then demi-sec, and then doux. So if you ever picking up extra dry, that means it's actually a bit sweeter than if it's a so if you like dry style.
There's more
Dry.
fruity than there is sweet.
Yeah.
What sugar do they add, Ruth? Is it just normal sugar?
They do. They add normal sugar, I think. Yeah, I did look this up. I'm pretty sure. Yeah, it's not concentrated grape must. This is actual sugar that they're adding at the end. So they're mixing it in with the wine beforehand. And that's one of the reasons why it has to be cellared for that extra 3 months before you can sell it, because otherwise you'd just be selling a bottle of wine. You've just stirred a load of sugar into it, and that doesn't marry well for a while. So they sort of leave it they call it marrying. I don't know what the way of translating that into English would be, but to kind of integrate, I guess, with the wine. So you don't notice the sweetness so much. It just becomes part of the taste of the wine.
So about how much sugar do they add?
Do you want to go back and see? You can see yourself.
Who's talking?
I just said about how much sugar do they add?
So it totally depends. I can look it up for you, actually. I have it in my notes, so I can make sure I get this correct. Here we go. So if it is extra brut, they're going to add up to 6 grams, but it could be none. If it's brut, it could be, and this is per litre. If it's brut, it's up to 12 grams of sugar. If it's extra dry, it's up to 17 grams. If it's sec, it's up to 32, so that's quite a lot of sugar. And demi-sec is up to 50 grams of sugar, and then doux is over 50, so that's quite a lot.
Ooh, a lot of sugar.
Wow.
So it gets quite sweet, quite quickly.
Sugar.
Might as well drink Coke.
Well, yeah.
Not as much fun.
Not as much fun, no. But
No,
it needs, the sweetening needs to happen for the same reason as with Coca-Cola. It's one of the reasons you always get a sweetener of some kind in your sparkling drinks, is because the carbon dioxide is acidifying as well. And so it's fairly unpleasant to have that without any sugar. And the sugar balances it so you don't notice it. So it just makes it seem refreshing rather than, unpleasant. It's what it is. You don't know, it doesn't taste as sweet as it actually is, if that makes sense.
Yes. Good.
But yeah, that's all the things that I had planned to tell you. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah.
There's a couple of questions on the chat
Oh yes.
page there.
Will my supermarket wine improve with keeping? So if you have a standard champagne, say that you've paid sort of 20-25 quid for normally, you would normally expect that wine might stay good for about a year after you've bought it, but because of the way that they've blended the grapes and the grapes they've chosen, it's not designed to age. So I talked about the 3 grapes. There's one in particular called Pinot Meunier, which is used in order to make a wine fruitier, younger, but it's not good for aging. So if you wanted to age a champagne for longer, then something that has a high proportion of the Pinot Noir or the higher proportion of the Chardonnay would be better, but normally more expensive as well. So if you want to keep a wine for a significant amount of time, I would say you probably want to be looking at more maybe like a 40-50 pound bottle. And then when you do get a good one, though, it will mature for a long time because it's got really high acidity. It's essentially pickled, and that will keep it fresh for a really long time. But some of them are just not designed for it. So better to drink it up.
Yeah, oh, good.
Yes. The sugar was per litre. Yeah, so those grams of sugar I was saying was per litre. So they talk about it in terms of percentages. So if you, if say I was talking about 50 grams of sugar, they would talk about that being 5% sugar, essentially. Yeah. What else have we got? Can disgorgement be automated? Yes, to a certain extent. It's certainly, a lot of places now have an awful lot more control over it, and they will do it under certain levels of differing levels of pressure. People do it in different ways throughout the winemaking world. It's not as automated as a lot of processes can be, but it's certainly gone closer in that direction as time goes on. But some places still do it completely by hand in the really old traditional way. If price was no object, what champagne would I drink?
That's a good one.
So there's the champagne that I had once that is Krug. Have you heard of Krug? If I type it.
Is that K-R-U-G?
Yeah, K-R-U-G. And I think it was 1996, I think it was vintage. So, you know, I was talking about those Cuvée Prestige that people have, like the Dom Perignon and the Grand Dame and the Cristal and stuff. Krug don't bother making anything that is not Cuvée Prestige. They only make super expensive, super delicious wine. And I was really lucky enough once that we sold in the shop I used to work in. We sold plenty of their stock over one Christmas, and so they took us out there on a little trip. And I tried this champagne that was Krug 1996, and it was the nicest thing I've ever. I mean, obviously, being in Champagne helped. Like having a delicious dinner and being treated really nicely and being put up in a champagne in a lovely hotel probably didn't really do any harm, but it was definitely the most I've ever enjoyed a glass of any kind of wine in my life. So yeah, Krug 1996, I would say. It probably today it will probably cost an absolute fortune to get your hands on that. But if you do ever get to try any kind of Krug vintage wine, trust me, it's delicious. Yeah, get someone else to pay for it.
I trust you, Ruth.
Yeah. Definitely don't pay for it yourself. That's the other thing. Like
yes. Never use your own money. Yep.
Fancy a bottle, Gary?
If you go on holiday for the amount of money it costs to buy a bottle of that, it's ridiculous. It's not the most expensive wine that they gave us, but it was the one that I thought was the nicest, certainly. What other question? How long before a bottle of white champagne is off? Oh yeah, that is a bit of personal taste. And some wines that will last for ages. I mean, the best thing that you can do is to store it in the right place. So don't store anything in your kitchen. Don't store anything where you've got central heating or anywhere where you've got lots of direct light, especially UV light, but any kind of bright light is bad. It's just going to damage your wine. So if you are going to store a wine, the most important thing you can do is store it in the right way, in the dark. Trying to make the closest sort of conditions that you can to a cellar, like a dark, danky, musty place that's nice and cool and no fluctuating temperatures. And that's your best decision. And then not worry about it.
Do you need to store wine with plastic bottles on its side?
Plastic is designed to deteriorate relatively rapidly, so definitely don't store plastic bottles or you're going to be ingesting plastic.
No, I didn't mean plastic, but I meant screw top. Sorry, wrong word.
That's good. Screw tops, it doesn't actually matter. You can store them on the, stood up if you want to, but if you've got a wine rack, it just makes sense that everything is lying down, I think.
So if you get a bottle of champagne, say I get given a present and I keep it for a year, is that kind of okay? Like no longer than a year and a half, or is it you can keep one for a few years and it doesn't matter?
We'll help you drink it, Roz.
Yeah, I mean, it will normally be fine. I mean, like I say, if you are storing it for a purpose in that you want it to get better, you might, unless you've got a particularly nice bottle, it's probably not necessarily worth the risk that you might not be storing it in the perfect conditions. And what will happen is it will sort of soften and change slightly, and it becomes slightly less fresh tasting, and maybe a little bit nuttier. So some people might like that, and some people might not like that. So that's the kind of personal tasting. But if you haven't got the right conditions to store it, then you run the risk of just making it a bit worse by anybody's standards. So just, yeah, I think the most important thing if you're ever storing wine is to have the right conditions to do it. Or otherwise,
Store it in your parents' shed.
or what, sorry?
I said just hurry up and drink it, but those are my parents. So
Oh yeah, they just want to drink wine.
Ruth, I've just seen a bottle of champagne that's £21,000.
What?
Yeah. What did they do to it to make it this price?
They put the price up. Right. Okay. So that's a Nebuchadnezzar. So that is 50 litres. So that's a big old bottle.
That's one big
I think as well. Is that a Jay-Z champagne? What's champagne? Don't Jay-Z and What's His Chops have a champagne that's called something like that?
Beyonce, Jay-Z and Beyonce, is it?
Yes, I think Jay-Z and Beyonce, it might be their brand, but at 15 litres is a lot of champagne as well. And
it looks bougie, doesn't it? Can you see, like gold bottle?
I think that is theirs, I think. You're paying for a whole load of bling if you're getting that one.
21,000.
Yeah, exactly. It's a status symbol. The minute you get into like massive bottles of champagne, it is all about the status. Never about better quality. It is just about like, look at the size of this massive bottle of wine.
But also,
people used to always say to me in the shop is like, but the Magnum is more than twice the price, but it's only like twice as much wine. And I was like, you're really missing the point of why people buy a Magnum. You know, it's like it's something, it makes the party special. You know, it's like, so you're paying for that, and that is Jay-Z's brand, I think, and you definitely.
That's really interesting. Thank you. 21,000. Wow.
Yeah.
a really big bottle.
Uh-huh.
So by the time you get to the last couple of glasses, there won't be any fizz left.
Good point.
No, I mean, I've heard loads of stories about like people in Hollywood and stuff drinking. They'll open like a bottle of Cristal champagne, which is extraordinarily expensive, and just pour themselves one glass and then just chuck the rest of the bottle away because it's not fully sparkling. I think if you
what a twat.
Yeah, the worst things about like the really expensive bottles of wine is the people that drink them and not the people that drink. I would appreciate that. I'm really bitter about who drinks the really nice wine.
We had a Nebuchadnezzar at a party once, and it kept its fizz all night. But it was the size of the baby to pour a glass. But I don't think anyone had paid for it. I think it was something to do with a film show that I was working on. But it was the size of a small seal.
Yeah. I don't think I've ever seen one.
It was.
You do that thing and put a teaspoon in the top.
This one tiny little teaspoon and this massive great big bottle. That would be
Ruth, I have a question. Ruth. Is it possible to keep champagne after you've opened it, like putting one of these in it or anything like that? Or once you open it, you've got to drink it?
Oh, so, well, that is going to pop out eventually. So if it, I don't know if anybody here has done it as well, but I have made the error before of like putting like a normal cork in a bottle of fizzy wine. And really thinking, I'll just really shove that in there and it will hopefully keep it fresh. Whereas in actual fact, that's really bad. Because what will happen is it will just build up so much pressure that eventually it will just ping out really super fast and maybe do some damage. These are the best bits for the job. So I don't know if you can see that properly. But so you take a bottle like this and you would put that in like that, and then it sort of clicks around the rim here, and that holds it in place, so you can then control when it is going to escape.
For how long? How long can you keep it like that, do you think? A couple of days or a day?
Yeah, I mean, it's not going to be getting any fizzier, but you know, it's up to you. I think if the best thing with sparkling wine really is to drink it if you can in one sitting, and so I think like maybe
Never
it's more justified to
long.
get half bottles if you don't, you know, it's not a silly move to buy half bottle of champagne if you don't want to drink a whole one, because it is going to go flatter. There's only so much you can do. I mean, obviously chilling it as fast as possible, keeping it as chilled as possible will keep the gas in it for longer. But yeah, just one of these is your best bet, but drinking it fast.
And where do you get them from?
Gary.
Pardon?
What did you say?
What was that last one?
He said, drink it, Gary.
Oh.
Drink it.
Yeah, drink it. Yeah.
What about
Oh,
the idea?
yeah.
Oh, we have another question. Does putting a spoon in it do anything? I have been asked this a few times as well. I mean, I do have colleagues that just simply say no. That it doesn't do anything at all, that it's an old wives' tale. The best explanation I've ever heard, and I don't know, some of you might dispute the likelihood of this, I don't know, but if you were to get a reasonably substantial metal spoon and pop it in a bottle and then put that in the fridge, then the metal is going to be the coldest thing about the bottle. So there is a small theory that it may create a slightly different atmosphere around that part where the metal is, because it's slightly colder than anywhere else. But I have a feeling that might be just really irrelevant. So probably does nothing. This is much more likely to keep the gas in because it stops the gas escaping.
Okay.
Any other questions?
On the chat, I put a question in about Cava. Is it the equivalent of champagne or is it the equivalent of Prosecco? Spanish Cava.
So Cava is, it suffers from a bad reputation. So it tends to be often produced to a cheaper price point. So for that reason, you often don't get the best quality of grapes, because if you want to make really high quality grapes, you have to charge more for them because it's harder to produce them and it takes more money. So often what goes into them might not be as high quality grapes as champagne, but legally, in order to call it Cava, it has to be made in this, what we call the traditional method, which is that making it go through all this autolytic process, everything happening within the bottle. So it is considered to be higher quality in terms of it has more flavour than maybe Prosecco does. But unless you get a nice one, you're not necessarily going to get anywhere near the quality of champagne. But if you do like your Cava, you can get some really, really good value for money. You just have to search out the ones that are a bit more expensive and that, you know, because they're really worth it. Or there is a new type of sparkling wine that there's like 9 producers in Cava who are really sick to the back teeth of their name being bad, you know, because they've been making really high quality wines, and people just sort of turn their nose up at Cava. And so they've taken the name Cava off the bottle altogether. And I'll type this for you as well, but they're calling themselves Corpinat. So if you find that on a bottle, that will mean it's coming from one of these 9 producers that make really, really nice sparkling wine in the same technique as Cava. So I really recommend that. And the more people that look that up, the more people that like try and seek those out and buy them, the more people will realize there is a market for them outside of Spain, and you'll see them more and more around as well. But at the minute, it's a bit specialized. It's not many people know.
We've had really nice Cava in Spain.
They do some lovely ones, they really do, and a lot of the time it's really hard to find them outside of Spain because of this bad reputation that they've got. So yeah, everyone get on the Cava bandwagon and the Corpinat. What grapes do they use for? And we've got another one earlier. So from my interpretation, does each company have its showcase champagne, a bit like a fashion house creating its signature clothing? Sort of, yes, yeah. And the way that the market works in Champagne is quite similar in terms of that it is about creating fashion and it's about creating a story and like making people feel like it's a special event and stuff. And it's you know, it's the a celebratory drink and stuff. So there's an awful lot of pomp and ceremony around champagne, I guess. Yeah, it's a bit like they have their top brand, if you like, and they'll push that. But people tend to find that they find the style that they like, and they just stick to it. And then what grapes do they use for Cava? So in Cava, they have some local ones. There's Paralada and Zarolo and Macabeo, which you might not have really heard of, but there is. They now are permitted to use Pinot Noir and Chardonnay in the blend as well. So you'll find some producers are essentially creating like a Spanish champagne in Spain. But yeah, the more traditional ones tend to have a slightly more earthy flavour. So I think sometimes people don't like that as much. But yeah, if you like the champagne style, look out for ones that have maybe Pinot Noir in it as well. They can be delicious. Any other? People disappearing and coming back in again. Hello.
Everything just dropped. I don't know why.
Well, what was that, Gary?
Everything's dropped out there for a second. I just lost the connection, but it's back.
Ah, I see. Oh, good. Okay. Does anybody have any other questions about anything?
Are you really going to open that bottle of champagne? Because you must have shaken it up so much.
No. This one's going back on the shelf because it's too expensive to
open. I was worried you might open it later.
I can't justify this for me. I have to open this to share in a work scenario or a real celebration-y.
I think it might explode.
Yeah, exactly. The only scenario I would open this for myself would be if I was home alone. Oh, for me.
Ruth, you should open it when lockdown finishes.
Yes, yeah. Whenever that is, that would be good, wouldn't it? That would be
I don't think you can keep it that long.
No, yeah, maybe. Have you heard of this thing called sabrage? Have you heard of that? Where people use a sword often to open.
Yes. Yes.
And
yes, dangerous.
I did actually get taught how to do it once, and the way that you do it is you take the cage off, and then underneath the cage holds onto this sort of rim bit that sticks out. So it has this little bit that just sticks out there, and you get your massive knife or your sword or whatever, and you don't use the thin end, you use the fat end, the blunt end, and you hold that towards the edge of it here, and then you just sort of smash it off. And it's really exciting, and I think that's how I'm going to open it at the end of quarantine. You go for exploding champagne everywhere.
We have to take a video of that.
Yeah.
The next event.
We need a video.
I think
Ruth, you have to do
on a bottle of Cava.
Ruth, you have to do a session on rosé. I'd like to know the 3 ways they make rosé. It's all very interesting. So.
Yeah, that's a good idea actually, and it's coming up to the type of weather where I think rosé will be coming back into stock in a big time as well. There's some lovely rosé. I could get down
just
with
an
that.
idea for a future show.
Yeah, nice one. I like it.
Yeah. I'd like to know a bit more about that.
Oh, what was that?
Wealth of knowledge. It was lovely.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Really good.
Ruth, is champagne your favourite drink ever?
No, I really like champagne, but you couldn't drink too much of it, I don't think. I say that, I probably could. I really, really like so many. People often ask me what's your your desert disc wine, and I find it really hard to answer. Blue Nun.
Oh no!
Definitely not Blue Nun.
Oh.
But yeah,
Patrice Rosé.
I wouldn't mind if I was forced to drink champagne for the rest of my life. It would be okay. But I think white Burgundy would probably be up there as well.
Yeah.
Surely your favourite wine is the one that's open, isn't it?
Wow, yeah. Or what, the free wine. The free wine is the best wine.
Yeah.
Have you been to a lot of the champagne houses then as part of your travels and research?
I've only been to a few. I think, Mum and Dad took us to one when we were kids. Oh no, maybe it wasn't Mum and Dad. I think we went to one on the French exchange with school, and then went to this one at Krug and Dom Perignon and Moet and Veuve Clicquot on this one trip. And other than that, no. So yeah, I really need to spend a lot more time in Champagne.
That's quite a number.
But it only really means that's only really over like 3 days, so it wasn't really not enough time. I need to spend more time.
Well, time to go and eat whatever Andrew's been doing in the background for the last half hour.
Yes, I should probably eat something.
Thank you very much.
Thank you guys. It's been absolutely
Very good.
Very good.
Thank you.
Bravo!
Are you